morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people from 72 countries that are signed up to join us, so welcome from all over the world. I'm not surprised because we have Dr. Ken Pelletier, and Ken is a very special friend of the Global Wellness Summit. He has spoken at quite a few of them. We have had 13, and he's written a lot of books. I have lost track. I think it's something like 12 or 13. I'm going to introduce Nancy Davis shortly, who will formally introduce Ken. Nancy is our Chief Creative Officer and Executive Director of both the Global Wellness Summit and the Global Wellness Institute. But before we do that, I just wanted to say that I have known Ken for 20 years. And as I mentioned, he's been a keynote speaker. He's written all these books. But I want to tell you something you may not know about him that I think is very important to this conversation and why we are all going to be taking notes and listening to every word he says. Ken, I have found out, has a photographic memory, which means that he remembers all kinds of details and has traveled all over the world, and that he knows everything about everything, it seems. And I suppose that having a photographic memory helps with that. But anyway, I'm just saying, Ken, I know most people don't introduce you that way, but it's a reason for us to really, really hang on every word that you say this morning. So I am glad you're here, Ken. Happy to know you personally, and I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who can do a more formal introduction.
Thank you, Susie, and good morning, everyone. I'm first just going to give you a few Zoom instructions, as we do at the beginning of every one of these calls, just to keep us on track. Beatrice, Control Central has muted everyone, and we're going to stay muted throughout this call because the amount of people on the call and the nature of this, it's much better to eliminate all the background noise. If you want to see a glorious global mosaic of people on the call, bring your cursor to the top right of your Zoom window and choose the gallery view. But when Ken is speaking and presenting at the beginning, I urge you to actually choose the speaker view so that you get a much larger picture of the dashing Ken Pelletier. There are so many people on this call, the pages will continue to increase. And if you go to the center right of your Zoom window, you can scroll on that blue arrow and see all of the people from all over the world. There is a chat function on Zoom, which everyone is already using, but I will just mention at the bottom center of the screen is a chat button. It opens a window to the right. And that's where we would like you to pose questions if you have them for Ken. We'll be looking at them throughout the call, aggregating them, and making sure that we get to as many of those as possible. And you will be receiving an email after with important links and things that come up on the call. So not to worry if someone says, oh, you should go to this link. We capture the chat window, we record all of this, and we will be sure to follow up. Now, Ken Pelletier. So the title of today's masterclass is From Self-Quarantine to Self-Immunization. And there's no better person to take us on that journey than Ken Pelletier. The list of Ken's degrees, academic positions, board seats, and books fills several pages, and that's something Beatrice will attach to the notes she sends out following this call. What's particularly relevant to the discussion this morning is Ken's work in epigenetics and how our behavior can influence our genes and determine outcomes for health and longevity, and how all of that applies to the battle being waged on COVID-19. Ken makes complex science understandable. He's as comfortable talking with His Holiness the Dalai Lama as he is talking to us this morning. He's a sailor, a scientist, a teacher, a scholar, an author, a speaker, a champion of empowering people to take charge of their biological destiny. And he has a voice like velvet, so enjoy. Dr. Ken Pelletier.
Oh my goodness, after those, thank you, Susie, thank you, Nancy, after those two introductions. This is not sunburn, it's blushing. So thank you both, very kind. If you can see behind me, it's dark because here in California, it's before the sunrise. So if this talk starts out a bit boring, it'll get better as I wake up and as the sun rises here on the Pacific Ocean. I just want to acknowledge the Global Wellness Summit. I am so happy to be talking to people from all over the world And that's what the Global Wellness Summit to me represents. I always, thank you, Susie, for your invitations over the years. I've always enjoyed this group because it's so unique. There are architects and spa owners and doctors and entrepreneurs and business owners, lawyers. I'm amazed and how everyone coalesces around a common theme of wellness, of really wanting to create a movement, an organization that represents health in the world. And there are very few. There are many organizations that use the word health in their title, and in fact, they have nothing to do with health. They're really disease management industries. And it's not, by the way, that's not intended to be pejorative. It's simply descriptive. Disease is the province of medicine. Management clearly follows from that, and at about 20% of the US GDP, it's certainly a business. But I think what the Global Wellness Summit to me represents is a true healthcare system. It's about health, it does care, and it's an approach that is systemic, from the individual to the environmental to policies, and it's global. So I am delighted to be here. And it strikes me that May, as you know from the Wellness Moonshot, again, thanks to Susie and Nancy, is the month to adapt. And I think if there's any theme that I think overrides anything I'm saying, is that we as individuals, we as a species, we as a planet need to adapt. We have a challenge, unlike anything we've ever experienced, called the COVID pandemic. And what I want to do this morning, I'm going to take about a dozen PowerPoints. I can't resist PowerPoints. You know, I'm an academic and I just get used to them. So I will provide, you know, content, and we'll certainly have a lot of time for discussion, which I'm looking forward to given this group. And I'll also have a few cartoons. For those of you that have ever heard me lecture know that I can't resist cartoons. I think they're just like opening up the psyche of the globe, and gives us a perspective on ourselves that I thoroughly enjoy. So with that, you know, I'll take about 15, maybe 20 minutes at most and go through these PowerPoints fairly quickly. What I want to cover is looking at COVID, but from a very particular point of view. We hear about the virus, and we hear about vaccines, and we hear about pharmacological interventions. Those are all external. And the point I want to make today is that what we have forgotten is that there is the milieu intérieur, and I'll get to what that is, but it's essentially the receptor site that we are as individuals, as cultures, as countries. The virus is essentially inert. It's out there. It's always been out there. COVID-20 is on its way. Count on that. That much is an absolute certainty. We've had 7 or 8 major epidemics, pandemics, and there are more to come. That much is a certainty. But what we're forgetting about is the receptor site. What makes individuals, countries, cultures, time susceptible to any and all external threats, viral, bacterial, environmental, toxins. And that's what I want to focus on, is what do we know about COVID? What don't we know? Which is much more than what we know. There's much more that we don't know. Thirdly, what the future looks like. What can we anticipate about this, this particular pandemic? And then lastly, what can we do? And to me, that's probably the most important thing for our discussion, is what's possible for us as individuals, as cultures, as a society, to fortify and defend, if you will, against this viral attack. So that's what I want to cover. And so if we can, let's launch into the PowerPoints, please. Oops, that's kind of far along. We need to go back to the beginning. Okay, all right, so that's, if you missed the introduction, that's who I am. Okay, next. So As I mentioned earlier, so this is the part about what we know, and it's the milieu intérieur. This is a phrase that was used initially by Claude Bernard, the French physician, in the mid 1800s. And what he meant by that is everything that's internal to the human body. It's the receptor site. It's who we are as a biological organism. And if we look at COVID and say, okay, so who is succumbing to this disease? The vast majority of people are not, even though the mortality statistics are horrifying. But if you look at the actual cause of mortality, 70 to 80% of mortality is for people over 60, so the older population, although most of them are institutionalized. They are not the healthy, vital, the 60 plus. They're people who are living in long-term care homes. They're male, they're lower SES. And again, we're looking at this globally. And again, they're the poor, they're the more vulnerable to any and all conditions, and have been disproportionately represented in terms of COVID mortality. They're non-white, Black in particular are suffering probably more than any other population. And most importantly, and I'm going to elaborate on this, are comorbidities. All of these individuals, virtually all, and I'm using the term all loosely, but we're talking 90 some odd percent when I say all, have comorbidities or pre-existing conditions, which is the actual cause of death. They are overweight, and there's a high level of clinical obesity. The seventh is very high cardiovascular risk. Here at UCSF School of Medicine, one of my jobs when San Francisco actually managed the COVID crisis extremely well for a city of its size. What I needed to do in the cardiology clinic was to evaluate people because, in fact, one of the leading causes of death is from cardiovascular congestive heart failure and other kinds of conditions. So high cardiovascular risk, meaning hypertension. Someone's coming in. And the other is they're immunocompromised, so cancer patients and people who are taking immunosuppression drugs. And as you've seen most recently now with children, we're getting people showing up with what's been termed Kawasaki syndrome. It's an overwhelming inflammatory response, occurs anywhere between a month to 6 weeks after exposure to COVID. The next bullet is that underlying all of these conditions is an immune dysfunction or immunocompromise. And that means that the person is more susceptible to all viral and bacterial infections. In terms of when we talk about the immune system, there are basically two parts. There's innate, which is the ongoing surveillance of our environment and protection. Then the second is adaptive, which is a system that learns and how to respond. And the COVID virus is a new virus, but it's in the coronavirus family, which is colds and flus. So coronaviruses are everywhere. There are literally trillions of coronaviruses. This particular one, for any number of reasons, has become active in our population. And the overwhelming adaptive response is what's called the cytokine storm. It's when the immunity becomes so overwhelming that it actually is what is the immediate cause of death. It's a hyper-inflammatory response to the COVID bacteria. By way of giving us a perspective, the Spanish flu of 1918 caused over 50 million deaths. 50 million deaths globally. Estimates have run as high as 100 million. So that was the most astounding. By the way, it was called the Spanish flu because the Spanish press was the first country that honestly began to report on it. And in fact, the Spanish king ended up dying of the Spanish flu. But it didn't start in Spain. That's another long story. So what we're looking at right now is an initial spike globally. But there are second and third and more pandemic spikes. That's what I want to really emphasize this morning. National Geographic did a study looking at their database of 7 to 8 major cities all around the world. I believe it was Rome, Hong Kong, London, Brazil. And what they found is that after every major epidemic. There's a spike, a trough, and then about 3 to 4 months later, there's another spike, not as high, not as protracted, but inevitably there is a second and even third spike. We are in for that. We're in for that. That's a certainty. Okay, next. So there are many different approaches. Sweden, as you know, has basically relied on herd immunity, not technically herd immunity. Herd immunity is actually an epidemiological term, and the death rate in Sweden has not been high enough to qualify as herd immunity, but Sweden really basically depended on its social structure to encourage, not mandate, lockdown. I was in Australia and New Zealand for about a month ago, and saw an extraordinarily positive response, as has Hong Kong. So there are many nations in the world, probably with the exception of the United States, that have managed the COVID pandemic actually much better than we have here in the US. The next is that this management, if you will, of this pandemic, has had a huge negative impact on medical care providers. Physician friends, nurses, physical therapists are really burned out. We cannot sustain this degree of impact on our medical care system. So on the staff, the delivery systems, hospitals are going bankrupt, practitioners are going out of practice, financially have had huge impacts, not to mention the emotional. The only thing similar is that after World War I, the president of the United States, Warren Harding, appointed the banker, Andrew Mellon, to oversee the reopening of the United States economy. And that decade after the World War I was characterized by exuberant pro-business, extremely no holds barred, business go at it, massive tax cuts, predominantly, again, to business, low interest rates, anti-immigration, a profound anti-scientific, don't bother me with the facts, I've got my opinion, and the deliberate creation of economic inequalities. That led clearly historically to the stock market crash of 1929 and triggered the Great Depression. So this is just a heads up. Where are we going as we open up the globe, as we open up our economies? Are we repeating this tragic decade? Beyond the deaths and the morbidity and mortality, there's stress in our populations. Fear is going to persist long beyond the COVID virus, this particular COVID-19 virus. Depression, suicides have increased. Domestic violence is astoundingly high. And here in the United States, sadly, gun sales have soared, as though somehow we're going to shoot the virus. And many of our metaphors, if you will, for dealing with this, it's a war against the virus, et cetera, is really delusional. So there are, and also we've ignored, by and large, the global clinical applications of evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine practices. We're talking about Ayurveda, TCM, homeopathy, botanicals, and other, and again, I emphasize this, scientifically sound practices that we call alternative or complementary, and are really, some of them are very, very effective, particularly with anti-inflammatories in managing cytokine storms. The last point, COVID-20 is on its way. Right now, somewhere on the planet, probably in one of these open air markets, a COVID-20 virus is transmitting from an animal to a human. So COVID-20 is already on its way. It usually takes about a year for it to become manifest, but it's coming soon. Okay, next. Now, as I mentioned, in Sweden, we haven't reached the end of this pandemic, and certainly more circumspection is in order. The famous Danish philosopher Kierkegaard stated, life can be only understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. We're heading into a future that none of us know what it's going to be like. It's going to be very different, and I think it's going to be permanently very different. And as we approach this turning point in this crisis, tempting to look back and see, which model has worked best. We don't know. That's the reality. No one has any idea of what the social order is going to look like, what we're going to do in the second and third waves of COVID-19. And that includes Sweden, which has in fact had a higher morbidity and mortality, as well as a greater economic impact than its Scandinavian neighbors. They may in fact turn out to have had the right solution. We just don't know, but I think it was a bold experiment by an unusual and actually very admirable country. Next. So this is from Donald Rumsfeld, the US Secretary of Defense under George Bush. This is an actual quote, believe it or not. He said, "There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know." This is an actual quote, and it was in during the nuclear disarmament negotiations with North Korea back in 2002. I simply say this is kind of where we are right now. We don't know. Thank you, Donald Rumsfeld. Okay. Last time I'll quote him I ever, that's for sure. Okay, next. So then last is what we do not know. We're talking about establishing immunity and antibodies, IgG, and this is just, again, these are such complex issues, and the media and media scientists tend to make this seem like it's an easy thing. There are so many false positives and false negatives. The antibody detection device used at the White House for the presidential staff gave a 50% rate of inaccuracy according to 2 subsequent tests. So this is the best we have to offer right now. Today gives do a coin toss. Take a blood draw, toss the coin. You'll have a 50% likelihood of getting it accurate or not. We don't know anything about exposure. We're beginning to realize that duration of exposure to the virus is clearly a problem. The duration of that exposure, and if seasonality is going to be a variable. It is increasingly now discussed about the fact that actually seasonality is going to decrease the incidence to some degree, but it's not going to expunge this particular virus. The third point is as I mentioned, the cytokine storm, and is the overwhelming response the body has to this virus, and the overwhelming response does so much damage to the body, the person ends up dying. And the major cause of death, final in terms of autopsy, is a coronary heart failure, myocarditis, which is a global inflammation of the vascular system, in particular the heart. And again, we hear about that the vaccine is coming. Well, again, this is one of those medical mythologies that is really problematic. It is not coming. Even if we get a quote vaccine by the end of 2020, early 2021, the reality is any vaccine has always been low in use and with uncertain effectiveness. Of the relatively small percentage, 30 to 40% in every given year get a flu shot. Of those individuals, any number of them who are vaccinated, in fact, end up developing the condition for which they're vaccinated against. In fact, there was just a study last week in the Annals of Internal Medicine. They looked at the effect of a flu vaccine in the United Kingdom on morbidity and mortality. They looked at, I believe it was, it's 170 million hospitalizations and 7.6 million deaths. And they looked at people who had been vaccinated versus those that had not. And what they found was no effect of flu vaccine on 170 million hospitalizations and 7.6 million. People who had the vaccination were equally represented in terms of morbidity and mortality. Didn't matter. So the low use, the uncertain effectiveness, the side effects, et cetera. So the idea that a vaccine is coming that's going to save us is simply a myth. And it's one that we need to be concerned about because it's diverting our attention. Interventional pharmacology. We've all heard about these things. There are probably 100 pharmacological agents. Remdesivir has side effects. CRISPR editing, the RNA editing, again, it's very, very new, untried. There's one vaccine that seems promising. There was a publication yesterday that 8 patients had developed antibodies, and the media went crazy. Well, what they forgot is that there are 8 patients that developed antibodies, really. There are monoclonal antibodies, et cetera. So there are many, even the next to the last one, llamas. It turns out that llamas, actually the animal, have antibodies that are 25% smaller than the human antibody, and it's thought that that could be more effective in terms of attacking the COVID virus. Okay, next. So I got one of those DNA kits. Turns out I'm 85% water, 8% dirt, and 7% dog pee. So we need to be wary of the jump to assays are going to cure us. Okay, next. I particularly like that slide. Okay, what we do know. That gram-negative bacteria are bacteria that basically have a double shield. They're more difficult to kill no matter what, in fact, we use. And the COVID is in that category of a gram-negative virus. There are COVID mutations. They're extensive, and they have unknown impact. When we say develop a immunization, against which form? The COVID has already mutated into 18 to 20 different forms globally. Patient 0, the question is, where did this come from? And at least there are many theories. There was a lab in China. It was a, there are paranoid theories about a lab in the United States, and et cetera. One thing is quite clear, is the environmental degradation and supposed open air markets, which really are slaughterhouse and animal torture sites. This is my political soapbox. They need to be regulated much more tightly. And I believe China has just passed legislation that dogs are now considered to be domestic pets and no longer wild animals and excluded from these markets. But if you've ever been to them, they're pretty overwhelming. There are post-COVID sequelae. I mean, among patients now, there are neurological consequences. There's coronary heart disease problems, and there are cognitive deficits, memory loss, attention span problems. We have the issue of asymptomatic virus carriers. We don't know how many. We do know that probably the vast majority of any given population would test positive for the COVID virus. They're asymptomatic and they're potential carriers. So it makes detection and contact tracing very difficult, if not impossible. And then certainly we have zootropic transmission, or from both domestic and wild animals, which requires public health regulation and off limits of certain animals in these open air slaughterhouses. Okay, next. Now, this is a common graphic, again, misleading that we see. We see the blue, it's the spike, then we see this nice little yellow curve, flattening of the curve, and everyone's heard this phrase. Well, this is really misleading. I mean, this flattening of the curve does not lead to no morbidity or mortality. The flattening of the curve is for one reason, is to reduce the overwhelming impact on the medical care system and basically attenuate the number of people going through care. It does not go to 0, and it's not that nice and flat. Okay, next. This is more likely. This, in fact, is the graphic that illustrates the Spanish flu. It had a spike in the middle, and then a number of ripples, and then about roughly 4 to 5 months after the initial was in another major spike. And again, the impact of this globally was somewhere between 50 and 100 million deaths. So this is the likely, and this looks to be over a period of the next 18 months, globally, likely to be the response we will see. By the way, when we look at the data and we say, oh, well, everyone's back and things are opening and things are fine, we're wrong. We're looking at a 4 to 6 week mirror into the past. What we're experiencing now in terms of benefit is because of the shutdown 4 to 6 weeks ago. We will not see the impact of reopening until 4 to 6 weeks from now. So we need to remember that when we get so exuberant over the fact that, hey, we're reopening and no, there isn't a spike in morbidity and mortality. We need to wait until mid to late June before we see the impact of what we're doing now in the middle of May. Next. So you don't look anything like the long-haired skinny kid I married 25 years ago. I need a DNA sample to make sure it's still you. Okay. Our DNA does not change, but what does change is its expression. You can see that he's clearly changed from his skinny kid he was 25 years ago. So it's what we do, not what we're endowed with, that makes all the difference in terms of our ongoing response. Okay, next. Now, what's interesting, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but this is thanks to Susie. By the way, you're now an official co-author of this presentation. This is from the Global Wellness Summit, and I love this. I think it was when we were in India. Actually, this was presented by the person from Bhutan who actually developed this. In any case, it's the happiness index. And if you look at the top 10 nations in terms of happiness, you find that they have the lowest COVID morbidity and mortality overall. And you see number 18 is the United States, which has one of the highest. This is not coincidental, because the factors that contribute to a healthy, productive society are the same factors that are protective against the COVID and future viral insults. Okay, next. Now, this is the checklist. So what do we do? I mean, everything, I think we've been cowered. We've been pushed into a corner by the media, by pronouncements from world leaders that somehow we are vulnerable, that we're susceptible, we're powerless against this overwhelming virus. That is utter and total nonsense. If we spent a fraction of what we're spending on vaccine development, on pharmaceuticals, in other words, challenging the external virus to fortify the host, to enhance the integrity of the milieu intérieur, that would do more to stem the likelihood of this virus subsiding and future viruses not having a foothold. So these are just a checklist of some things. I'm going to go through them quickly and then we'll have discussion. Meditation and stress management. Stress clearly leads to immunocompromise. Immunocompromised individuals are susceptible to every form of chronic condition, viral, bacterial infection. Sleep and sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is a major precondition for coronary heart disease, which again is a major cause of death when people are hospitalized. By the way, the ventilator issue is again, it's a smokescreen. You have to look carefully. About 80% of people put on ventilators end up dying. It's not a cure. It's a way to sustain life beyond a point of reasonable likelihood. There are miraculous recoveries. I think it's wonderful, and I think for the families and individuals, it's phenomenal. But as a policy, it's a phony policy. So we have the psychosocial environment. The shelter in place is the opposite of social support. People need people. We are going to need some way of finding how to recreate the social connectiveness. The lack of social support is a major predisposing factor to disease. The physical environmental degradation goes without saying. Again, I think the open air markets, really slaughterhouses is what they are, need to be regulated much more carefully. The source of many of these pandemics has in fact derived from open air markets. And the environmental degradation from petrochemicals being introduced, glyphosate, Roundup being introduced globally, is very damaging and in fact creates a hotbed for viral infection. There was a study a couple of months ago that they looked at glyphosate or basically Roundup and found that plankton in the Antarctic Ocean, every single cell of plankton, one single cellular organism, had evidence of glyphosate in its organism. So we've literally poisoned every single cell on the planet. We have phytochemicals that we can use, quercetin, resveratrol, curcumin, turmeric, green tea, and other botanicals are powerful anti-inflammatories. So when we talk about cytokine storm as being a major proximal cause of death in COVID, there are many of these phytochemicals, some of which have very good clinical evidence. They in fact can help ameliorate the cytokine storm. The next is spirituality, certainly a turning inward. This has been a time that has forced us to turn inward, to family, to friends, into ourselves. I think the Global Wellness Summit initiative with the Vatican is an example of this global turning toward meaning. Do we really want to go back to how things were? We talk a return to, quote, the new normal. I wonder what the new normal is going to look like. It has to be different. We've had time, we've had a couple of months globally to consider values and to consider our internal terrain. Connection to nature, parks, oceans, and open spaces. The one thing Sweden did not do, it did not close down its parks. And I think that's astounding. I think that was a real error. You could regulate access to the nature, but that was a major error here in the US and in many countries. You basically cut people off from the natural environment. Dietary practices, unequivocally effective in terms of, again, fortifying the host, increasing health and well-being. The Mediterranean diet is essentially the one diet that has unequivocal evidence of efficacy for the most number of people, for the most number of conditions globally, unequivocally. It's the only diet that has any data. The rest of it is all frontline headlines. I mean, diet of the day. I mean, now out of this, the grapefruit fasting diet and you name it. No, celery juice. Celery juice is the latest one. And fasting, I think, is a good idea. There are many forms of fasting. 1 day fast is reasonable. 1 day a week, you simply don't eat for 1 day. You pick a day and do water and fruit juices. Physical activity, unequivocally, physical activity enhances our immune response. So it'd be high intensity for some people that need that. There could be yoga, could be Pilates, but I think that's very clear. Healthy aging, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we say the older people or individuals who are succumbing to COVID, these are not the healthy aging population, which is the number of people over the age of 100 is one of the most rapidly growing populations on the planet. And we do now have measures, telomeres, which is a particular chromosome that indicates a person's rate of aging and actual biological age. We can alter that. We can actually extend and enhance the telomeres, which induce healthy aging, longevity, quality, and quantity of life. Epigenetic assays, this is one of my favorite topics. I won't go off on this one, but certainly the ability for personalized medicine, not to guess if a pharmacology is good for you or not. We can know in a matter of minutes and hours. We can tell, are you aging well, are you aging poorly? You can get down to a level of saying, eat walnuts, not almonds, because genetically you're more predisposed to benefit from almonds, from walnuts. The last one is telemedicine. One of the good things that's happened, at least here in the United States, is to break down the barriers about the trans-state practice of medicine using computer interactive systems, interacting with patients at a distance, because we've had to. The use of biometrics or transponding information, EKGs, various forms of functions to clinics and offices is unequivocally here to stay. So these are just a few of the things that take us away from withdrawal into self-immunization, to stabilization. Last thing I'll say about the immune system is we hear, I guess I see on the internet, enhance your immune system, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need an enhanced immune system. We need a stable immune system. You don't want hyperimmunity. That's in fact a cause of death in COVID. What we want is an immune system that's stable, and all of these variables will do that. Okay, next, and I think it's the last. Okay, this is too much at this point. Maybe the last PowerPoint. There he goes. Okay, so that's all for now, folks. And thank you for your attention. And I think we have some time for discussion. So thank all of you.
Ken, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And let me say, sobering. I think I probably speak for everyone saying thanks for all the good news. Yikes. But lots of very interesting things, and people are posting some questions. I have a couple of things to ask aggregated from that. If a vaccine is not the answer, which it seems from your talk, it's not necessarily like the silver bullet that everybody has been saying it is, then what is? What do we do? Is it about, oh, sorry, Don was sharing the screen. Is it about these self-immunization strategies that you just touched on? What is it that people should be doing?
Well, if we look at vaccines, they've never been the end of an epidemic, ever. Vaccines always come toward the end. If you think about a time lag in vaccines, anywhere between 15 to 24 months, that's too late. And if we get a COVID vaccine, the production, dissemination, the COVID is going to burn itself out. What we've seen in every prior pandemic is that roughly 18 to 24 months after its peak, it's gone. It's disseminated in the population. There's a general immunity in the population. So by the time the vaccine comes along, it's too late. It may catch a few cases. It may immunize a few people. For those that use it, maybe a few of them will get benefit, most won't, and most won't use it. So vaccines are not the answer. What we do need to look at is we need to look at the preconditions that give rise to these virulent bacteria, viruses that are in our environment. I think we need to realize that COVID is not new. COVID has been around for centuries, thousands and thousands of years. There are millions of viruses out there. So we need to basically create an environment which does not allow that virus to enter into the human population and to create the kind of havoc that COVID has. So one is we need to do environmental protection, environmental quality. And then generally for ourselves, for individuals and cultures, if we put more funding into reduction of weight, reduction of cardiovascular risk, reduction of stress, improvement of diet and nutrition, a fraction of the money that's going into vaccine and pharmacological development, we would do more to stem the receptivity and the likelihood of a recurring virus. Because again, COVID-20 is on its way. We've got about a year to get ready.
Why the perfect storm right now? If these viruses are around, and they are, and 20 is coming, and these things are in our environment, in the air, whatever, waiting to be transmitted all the time. Why right now has this caused the pandemic it's caused?
Right, if you look at, this is the 8th pandemic that we've had. So we've had others, SARS and MERS, that were equally virulent. They did not they were not easily transmittable. COVID is very easily transmitted through the air you breathe. You don't even have to cough or sneeze on someone. If you're in an enclosed environment with limited circulation of air, that's what makes returning to the workplace difficult, or church services, or any large gathering. Simply breathing and an asymptomatic person, they don't know they have COVID, even breathing can transmit it. So it's been an easily transmittable virus. That's a main thing. The other is that the relative delay in lockdown. Social distancing is the only thing in every single previous virus, including the Spanish flu, that actually had an impact in slowing the rate of dissemination. The virus was there. It's how many people were affected and therefore how many people died. That becomes the variable. So if we slow it down through, again, public health measures that too many were familiar, I won't repeat them, but basically the social distancing and hygiene is what enabled us to basically weather the storm. And it's helping, it's still the only thing we have right now.
And do we just ultimately learn to live with these things in a certain way if they're going to keep coming?
We are going to continue to have viral infections, unequivocally. There are viruses that simply overcome our immunity, that find hotbeds and find receptor sites globally, and we will continue to have virus. It's a matter of how virulent it becomes. Are they going to induce a lot of morbidity and mortality or not? But we're going to have virus. We all hear it. The television advertises it. The cold and flu season is here, and predictably the cold and flu season arrives. But we don't look at the people who don't become ill during cold and flu season, which is the vast majority.
Ken, can you talk about antibodies and the current rush to antibody test and whether that has an effect on anybody's immunity or, resistance to COVID?
Well, antibodies are the result of exposure. So when your body is exposed to a virus, it produces an antibody. The antibody, through your immune system, mediates or defends against that, and they have a residual. So the antibodies are residuals that are remained in your system, presumably providing future protection. That's the mechanism whereby we produce antibodies. The problem with antibody detection is, again, you're not sure which variant of the COVID virus are you immune against. How long does that immunity last? Is it immunity for a day, a month, a year? Is it a lifetime immunity? We have no idea. How accurate is the test? As I mentioned, the test in common use today in the White House produces a 50% accuracy rate, so you might as well flip a coin. And again, when a person detects, the idea of an antibody certificate, that somehow you get a test, you've got a certificate, and then you can go and fly and do everything else, is just nonsense. You can test that you have an antibody one day, and a week later, that antibody may or may not be effective in immunizing you. And you also can get a negative. Well, you do not carry the COVID virus. You may in fact be a passive carrier. It goes undetected because the antibody detection systems are not accurate. So this again, it's this fallacy. The biology makes sense. The detection and the subsequent public policy, that's where we get into trouble, and that's where it begins to make no sense. The microchipping, the issuing of an antibody passport, again, that's somebody's fantasy, but not a reality.
Ken, there's been a question. Oh, Susie, I'm sorry. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Ken. That was fantastic information. You are particularly aware of our audience. We are people who are in some ways trying to help other people get well or stay well. What would be your advice to us? What should be our rallying cry? What is the one common thing we should be talking about or doing? How can we take advantage of this crisis to get more people involved in their own health and wellness?
Well, that's a great question. And you've articulated, of course, your mission very well. It's one with which I have a heartfelt connection. The point is that if we look at who succumbs, who becomes ill, and who dies, it is from the presence of comorbidities, chronic conditions that compromise our health. The mission of everyone I've ever encountered at the Global Wellness Summit in their own way is enhancing the quality of life, the quality of the environment for the people with whom they have contact. If that continues, that is the greatest contribution we can make. This is where we have the kernel of a true healthcare system. The efforts of every single person in the Global Wellness Summit, whether it's in a spa, a business, architectural design, environmental quality protection, global happiness. These are all measures to increase health. Health leads to fewer chronic conditions. Fewer chronic conditions leads to less susceptibility to all future viruses.
And what is it that people will respond to? The word prevention, resilience, improving your immunity or stabilizing your immunity. What can be some different ways we can be speaking with people? Because, the obesity rate keeps going up and up, and we're doing what we're doing, but somehow it's not, as effective as we'd like it to be.
Well, I actually think it has been effective. If you look back over the 12 or 13 years as you began the Global Wellness Summit, if you look back over that time and the change in population in terms of diet, exercise, yes, obesity is increasing. That may or may not be a problem, quite honestly. At least weight gain, not true obesity, but weight gain, that may or may not be a problem. But the general trajectory of the overall population has been toward health. And I think that's increasing. There are now policies that I'm actually working with one major national insurance company having genetic testing tied to life insurance, so that you get a genetic test, you have a predisposition to a certain disease, you agree to participate in a program. In turn, you get a reduction in your life insurance policy because they know you're less likely to die and collect on that policy. So that's kind of an ingenious way of looking at it. But I'm actually very optimistic. And I think the use of the term wellness, again, it's been around for probably 30 years, but you need to repeat it over and over. That's a perfectly good word. There are others like resilience and that are also very good. I don't know if there's any one word that's going to triumph, but I actually like the term wellness. When I first heard it 30 or 40 years ago, John Travis, that you've already had the global wellness meetings, I didn't like that word. I thought it was weird. Now I actually have come to really like it, and I think it's a perfectly good phrase to use. We're helping individuals attain wellness, optimal health, optimal longevity.
What do you think of the word self-care?
Oh, I like it because in reality, all health is self-care. Just taking a medication is self-care. Most people do not take medications that are correctly prescribed for their condition. So they're not even, you don't even go that far. But self-care in terms of diet and physical activity, stress management, ultimately, it comes down to choices that we make day in and day out. We know, literally, we know we are not victims of our genetics, that choices we make day in and day out, everything we do has a direct impact on our genes. 95% of what we are as adults, how long we will live, the kind of conditions we will have, the health we will enjoy, is based on minute-to-minute choices. William James, in his famous writings, was suffering from a crushing depression. And he realized that he had a choice between one thought and the next. And in that infinitesimal moment, he says, I can choose to have one negative thought lead to a next negative thought, or I can have a negative thought lead to a positive thought. That one insight led him to rouse himself from a major depression. And I think we as individuals and as cultures are in a depression right now. And realizing the impact of choice is huge.
I like that, the impact of choice. Fantastic. Thank you, Ken. And Nancy, over to you. I know you have other questions, but thank you.
Thank you, Susie.
No, one of my questions was what is the role of the wellness industry? So that I think we're good with that, and I think we all do feel on these calls, a sense of responsibility to do something and to get the word out. We had a very robust conversation about the media and what the media is doing to this story, and to information. And I wonder why the very clear, sound, scientific information you've given us today is not what we're hearing when we turn on the news. So it's really interesting because it's your information is so sound, but it's different than what we're hearing.
Well, my friends in the media have a cliche: if it bleeds, it leads. People pay attention to bad news. And I always recommend for my patients, take a news fast. Don't watch the news for a week or 2 weeks. I'm sure all of you have had the experience of being away for a week or 2 weeks. I did for a month where I didn't watch the news. You come back, you turn it on, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And it's like a hypnotic induction. If you hear the same thing over and over and over and over, you begin to believe that's how things really are. And the things we're talking about are not dramatic. They're not bleeds, it leads kind of issues. Every now and then we hear about some breakthrough in health, but it's normally some sort of pharmacological or surgical breakthrough. That's not health. That's managing disease in a new way, albeit nothing I'm saying is against good medicine. If you get hit by a car, you want a good trauma surgeon. That's not the time to meditate. But before you get hit by a car, if you did meditate, you probably wouldn't have that happen. So I think the media, again, have a lot of culpability in engaging a continual barrage of bad news because it sells their story. That's unfortunate, not to be believed. Friends have called it the local reality. And I think it's all of us to challenge, what are we really hearing? That's part of what I tried to do this morning, which is look at the myths that we're being told about this COVID virus. Most of it is a mythology. It's a story we're being told. It's not a reality unless we believe it and buy into it.
Ken, I wonder if we could, we've been hearing a lot about silver linings throughout this, and it's everything from, people having family dinners again with their children, and the less, sort of on the rat race and more time in nature and things like that. What's the silver lining, the one silver lining you see?
To me, it's the turning inward. There are decades of research on the benefits of meditation. There are thousands of years of different meditation practices and extolling the virtues of that. More than anything, we've been forced to turn inward, whether it's family, to our pets and animals, to reading poetry, to watching movies that we enjoy. But we've been forced inward by and large, retreating from what we perceive to be a hostile environment. And if we pay attention to our values, if we pay attention to the voices inside of us that have begun to appreciate clear skies, improved water quality, the ability to walk and ride and be engaged in a positive way, if we preserve those values from turning inward into the future, it's going to be a better future.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was incredible. I'm going to, in a moment, give Susie the last word, but I did just want to say, on behalf of everyone, and you will get the chat, copy, and you'll see all the people thanking you and feeling this was just the best information, ever, and very grateful for your time and your thoughtfulness about this. I also want to say that Ken is gifting everybody a downloadable PDF of his book, of the most recent book, which really does support all of the stuff that he has been saying. And that will also be in the follow-up that you get, with lots of links and information and all kinds of things. But this has been just enormously helpful, clarifying, scary, and hopeful all at the same time, which is nothing short of a miracle. And I thank you truly. And I just give Susie the last word.
Thank you, Nancy. And I'm going to give Ken the last word. I want you to tell us about that book, because it's fantastic and very hopeful and encouraging. So tell us about your latest book that we're going to get.
Well, in a nutshell, the elevator speech on the book is that one of the greatest mythologies that we have, both individually and I think professionally, is that genes govern everything we do. They govern our height, our weight, how long we live, our susceptibility to disease, et cetera. The reality is less than 5% of who we are as adults is due to monogenic or fully penetrant genes. The rest, 95% of who we are as adults, what we experience for the rest of our lives, and literally how long we will live, is dependent on genetic expression. What we do and do not allow our genes to express through the choices, through our activities on a daily basis. And the book basically looks at diet and stress and environmental factors and exercise and pharmacology, and says, what do we know how to optimize our genetic expression for optimal health and longevity? That's it.
And the name of the book?
You don't need the book.
and what's the name of the book, Ken?
Change Your Genes, Change Your Life.
And now I'm going to ask Beatrice to unmute everyone so we can give you a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, take it away.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Global gratitude.
So much.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.